what we're going to be talking about is meditation now. Just out of curiosity, how many of you right now have a meditation practice, a regular meditation practice? Okay, one person. How many of you have wanted to, have struggled with the monkey mind, and you've just, in frustration, given up? Okay, be honest. All right, great. And how many of you are like, I don't know anything about meditation. I'm here to learn. Okay, good. And so what I really want to explain are the why, what, and hows of meditation. A lot of times you'll have people that'll tell you how to meditate. But a lot of times people don't understand why you meditate. And they don't know what kind of meditation to practice. And oftentimes when people ask me, I ask them, why are you meditating? Because you get different results, or at least I have noticed different results after different types of meditation. My personal practice is transcendental meditation. It's just the one that worked best for me. Even though I teach about meditation in the beginning, I didn't find that it was very easy. My mind raced, and I think that's why I'm a good teacher. I've tried everything out there until I found something that worked. But while I was going through that exploration, I started to understand why there are so many different types of meditation. So the reasons of why we meditate. Usually when I ask someone why they want to meditate, it's because they're stressed out and they just want to learn how to de-stress. They might maybe have some health issues, and they have heard that meditation helps with pain or it helps with depression. So, sometimes there are health reasons. Sometimes people just want to meditate because it increases happiness. There is chemistry that happens in the body that creates a mood elevation. It's like serotonin. So sometimes you just want to feel healthy and happy and have that sense of well-being. As artists, I think a lot of people also don't sometimes see the connection, but meditation will help with creativity, because as you kind of release those blockages, it opens up that creativity. And then a lot of times people start with all of these reasons and end up in the spiritual practice, because oftentimes when you are meditating, things start to change in your life. And when those things start to change, it starts getting you to ask those deeper questions of why is this happening? Is there some connection with this synchronicity? And I also like to point out, you look at someone like the Buddhist monks or other religious practices where they're in contemplation, sitting for many, many hours. They're probably not doing it because they're stressed out. They're doing it for a spiritual exploration. They want to expand their consciousness, and there are some very interesting studies that have been done with Buddhist monks to explain that their brain chemistry, their brain activity changes after many, many years of long seated practices of meditation. They see the brain waves go more into the gamma regions, which is a different type of brain wave that we usually don't see in your average people. So the medical benefits of meditation, I think mostly we're talking about the brain. So when chemistry changes, it's changing not only because of the glands in the body, but also because of the changes in the brain. So we do see behavior in the frontal cortex. Basically, you're pulling yourself out of that fight or flight mode and into that kind of rest and relax or digest or whatever they like to call it. But it's more than just a relaxation state. When you get away from the sympathetic and get into the parasympathetic, you create different chemistry. And when you create different chemistry in the body, you feel different. You feel better. Neuroplasticity, they've noticed in regular meditators that they start creating new neurons and different connections start happening, new pathways. And they think that might be why behavioral changes, a lot of times you'll hear that people become more compassionate, more loving. They have a tendency to be calmer when there's chaos around them. They kind of pick and choose the kind of things to get upset by. Things don't trigger you as much. And that's probably a little bit from that neuroplasticity and learning new behaviors. if people who are doing diets, people who are trying to give up smoking, a lot of times when they start with meditation, they start finding that it's easier because they have more control over the impulses. So impulse control, like I say, increase in compassion, love, and joy. There's a chemical reason for that. When you're meditating, you start producing, like I produce serotonin, and it's a very noticeable change in me. It usually happens about a half hour, 40 minutes after I meditate. And I just notice it because I get kind of sing-songy to the radio. I'm more bubbly. Nothing really ruffles my feathers. Someone can do something and I kind of laugh it off, whereas if I hadn't meditated or I was in a different kind of mood, it would be a trigger. So you do notice a difference in your behavior because of the chemistry that's in the body. pH balance. Meditation, you have a tendency to slow down your breath. And any of you who've been in my morning class or have heard me talk about the science of breathing, there's a lot of really interesting science behind slowing down the breath. And when you slow down the breath in meditation, you start to change again. Go back to that chemistry, and the pH balance is one of those things. Endorphins a lot of times are released in the body, and it has an opiate effect. So if you have pain, a lot of times people will say, oh, I tried to meditate and all I could focus on was my pain and I just can't meditate. Your pain is not going to go away during the meditation. Sometimes it does, but for the most part, especially if you're a new meditator, you're probably going to have a little bit of time unwinding and getting relaxed in the body while you're meditating, because all you're going to be able to think about and focus on is your pain. But if you can get to a point, it might take you 15 minutes to calm the brain down enough to start noticing other things beyond the pain. But if you can kind of disconnect yourself from that pain, you a lot of times will start to create endorphins later on. So what I say is, if you're in pain and you're doing meditation, see how you feel a half hour after you finish, an hour after you finish. How do you feel the rest of the day? In transcendental meditation, they train you to meditate for about 20 minutes to a half hour in the morning, and then again 20 minutes to a half hour in the evening. I have a tendency to do it first thing in the morning before I shower. I get up, go to the bathroom, sit down, meditate, and then around, and I'm self-employed, so I can sit down at 4 o'clock and do another session, but some people wait until they get home from work. But it's basically like recharging your batteries. I feel really good, and then I kind of know when I need to meditate again because I'm starting to get irritated by things. So my clients don't even realize it, but they benefit from me meditating because I'm just easier to deal with. And when they're sending me edits after edits after edits on the 15th time, I'm still pretty cool and chill about it. Serotonin, that's that mood regulator. That's what I really notice. But because I'm not in a lot of pain, I would probably maybe notice some relief in pain if I were in pain. But for me, what I really notice is the serotonin. And when I was getting my certification at the Mindfulness Center in Bethesda, Maryland, if anyone's from the Maryland area, the Mindfulness Center where I got my certification is run by a neuroscientist. So I asked her, and I asked my graduating class, there were about 30 of us in class, and I said, I'm curious, how many of you notice this elevation in your mood about a half hour after meditating? And about a third to a half of the class raised their hand. And so I asked the leader of the center, I said, Dr. Norris, what is it? What is doing that? Is that the endorphins? And she said, no, not the endorphins, it's the serotonin. Now, all of the studies that they've done on meditation, they oftentimes yield different results. So the information's kind of all over there. You might find one that talks about increase in endorphins. Another one might talk about serotonin or blood sugar or human growth hormone. I think first of all, I think the body has a tendency to go to wherever it needs to. So if you're in pain, maybe your body knows that you're going to benefit more from endorphins, whereas if you're not in pain, it's kind of nice to have the serotonin. I literally feel like I've had a cocktail after I meditate. That's what kept me meditating, because I love that kind of bubbly feeling. And a lot of times when I say that to other meditators that don't get that, they get a little bummed out. But I'm sure they're getting, chemistry too that is benefiting them. It might be regulating their pH control or their hormones, their blood sugar. So, who knows what you need. But just be aware that there is chemistry going on. Obviously, you lower your stress hormones, so your cortisol and adrenaline. A lot of times, the first line of defense for people who've been in the military with post-traumatic stress syndrome is meditation. And they actually find that meditation works better than the medicines that they give. So that's usually why they try to get you, like here in the VA. And it's probably less expensive too, sit you down and meditate. That's probably why they first started doing it, because it was less expensive. But I think a lot of PTSD is from adrenal fatigue. If you've spent a lot of time in fear for your life and it just goes on day after day, week after week, your adrenaline is really only supposed to be in like minor, little spurts. It's supposed to help you save your life. You have a little bit that goes off in the morning to kind of wake you up and stimulate you. But if you are constantly in worry of your life, you are always stimulating this lower chakra down here, which is all about survival. And that chakra, and I'll talk about chakra in a minute, but each of the main chakras up the body are associated with a main gland. And the root chakra is associated with any kind of fear of survival. So if you've got physical fear of survival, like, if a bear is chasing you, I used to talk about my little story about when I had a run-in with a bear in West Virginia. I scared it as much as it scared me, so it scampered away in the opposite direction. But believe me, I had all kinds of adrenaline going through me when I picked up the dog and ran. I didn't know it wasn't chasing me. I thought I got to the cabin so fast. So, your adrenaline and all of that is a necessary function, if a bear's chasing you. But if you're stressed out constantly throughout the day about deadlines, that's the same draw on your adrenals. And a lot of people who have issues, health issues, don't realize it, but if you're stressed out all the time, you might be creating some drain on your adrenals. Oxytocin is something that some people know it as the love hormone. It's a hormone that is meant to keep you coupled up long enough to stay together, to have a baby. Hang on. Women produce it when they're nursing, but they've also found that some people produce it when they meditate. Melatonin helps regulate sleep. Human growth hormone helps you when you're young. It helps you grow, but when you get older, it helps you heal. And you only actually produce this down in the lower levels of sleep. So I'm going to talk about sleep in a minute too. But just think, if you don't get a lot of sleep, but yet you meditate and your body needs, the human growth hormone, maybe your body through meditation will start to create that. So, and DHEA is kind of like a longevity molecule. I like to talk about sleep, not because you should fall asleep while you're meditating. You actually have different processes that go on when you sleep as opposed to when you're meditating. And I sometimes step out of the science and I move over into the energetic stuff, and I start talking about prana and things like that. So when I talk about more of the metaphysical stuff about meditation, it's very important to understand that there's a difference between how your energy works when you are meditating and when you are sleeping. And I'll talk about that in a little later on in the presentation. But I just want to point out, right now, we are in beta, or at least I am. I'm actively using my brain talking to you. If you're bored. You might be down in the alpha wave. If you're really, really bored, or if you ever like been driving a car or doing a repetitive task and you almost kind of go into that trance, and before you know it, you're like 20 miles and you're like, gosh, I don't even remember passing that town. Well, you're probably in the theta. You're still awake, but you're kind of in that state that you don't like to be in when you drive, but sometimes are. And sometimes you get that in repetitive tasks, and it's just kind of like you go on autopilot. But when you get into kind of lower levels of theta and delta, these are usually what you're in when you're sleeping. So this is really kind of where you are when you go from level 1 to level 2 when you're sleeping. And I'm going to go back up to the other one in a minute, but again, when you're awake, you're up in this beta. Alpha is kind of that in-between state. Again, you can be bored silly and maybe be in this alpha right now, but hopefully you're not that bored. But when you start dipping down into theta, this is where you're dreaming. These darker bars here, that's your REM sleep. That's your rapid eye movement. That's when you're dreaming. And this is a necessary part of your sleep cycle. If you are deprived, and there are studies of this, but if you're deprived of REM sleep long enough, you'll start to have hallucinations, you'll start to have mental issues, because you need that. Whatever we do in that REM, it has something to do with how we process our emotions and our thoughts, and it just lines up the mental. So if you end up being deprived of that, you would notice some mental issues. If you have too much REM sleep, like if you sleep a lot and you get stuck a lot in this REM, a lot of times they see depression in people. If you end up moving down into the theta, a lot of times people try to do meditations and find theta meditations and stuff like that, and they replicate brain waves in the music to kind of coax your brain into that. And this is where it's kind of considered to be intuition and spiritual health, where you're connected more to the heart. And so a lot of focus is getting people into that meditative state of theta, and that's probably where most people end up if they're doing meditation and you're doing it long enough where you kind of slip into that kind of otherworldly kind of feel. And then delta is the very lowest level of sleep, and this is where human growth hormone is produced. This is really about healing and growth. So when you're little, that's the hormone that keeps you growing, but when you get older, that's the one that continues healing. So if you look, these are the hours down here. So if you look in this first hour, you see the body really kind of beelines you to get down into the delta. It's that important. If you're only going to sleep for an hour or so, your body wants you to get down into here and get you into a healing mode. And as you start to come up, then you'll dream. Then you dip back down again. Around hour 3, you come back up, you dream, and you notice that you spend more time up here toward the end of your sleep cycle. And you end up having more dreams. A lot of times your dreams feel like they go on forever. They usually just unwind in the brain pretty quickly. But back to the meditation, though. If you don't sleep well, but are starting to create a practice of meditation and even mindfulness and breathing, if you find that meditation doesn't work for you, you can still get some of these benefits by simply doing some therapeutic breathing. But again, this awake stage, this beta, that's consciousness, busy, anxious. Sometimes people, when they get kind of hyper, they're in that kind of beta awake stage. The alpha, I like to point out the hertz, the frequency of this. These are the brain waves, these HZs here. This is what I was showing you with the little squiggly lines. And I like to also point out this range right here is very close to the 7.8 range of the Schumann resonance. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Schumann, sometimes you hear a lot of people talk about that. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there on the web about the Schumann resonance. I do think it is raising. The Schumann resonance is basically electromagnetic kind of frequency. Some people call it the sound or the heartbeat of the planet. We have actually been measuring it for 50 years, and it's always been at the 7.8 until, like, I want to say maybe 2014. They started noticing that sometimes it would spike and it would be different. And it's actually a resonant rate of like 3 or 4 different frequencies that they pick up. And so, all throughout the world, they have these machines that kind of measure this. And in some areas, there's more going on with the Schumann resonance and some less. But I like to say, though, if there is something so a lot of people think because that Schumann resonance is starting to peak and shift a little bit, if we're in tune with the planet we live on, and she's having some frequency that is going up and there is some change in her, how is it affecting us? If we are tuned to this in the alpha state, also that happens to be the frequency that the heart has a very large electromagnetic field. It pulses out. They can measure it 14 to 16 feet off of the body. So you're all sitting in the electromagnetic heart field of all of the people in this room. Think about all of the people within 14 feet, and it probably goes further than that. That's just how far they can measure it with the equipment. So this alpha state, and I talked about these studies when you're deprived from REM and when you're deprived from down here in delta. So that was when I was saying you end up having some memory loss, hallucinations. Excessive is linked to depression. Down in delta, when they do that study, if people are deprived of delta, they end up having signs that mimic fibromyalgia. So there are some studies now where they're trying to see the link between people who don't sleep very well and people who have pain like fibromyalgia. So there are different types of meditation, and the reason is because there are lots of different types of personalities, and what works for one person is not going to work for somebody else. So I know people who take to meditation very easily. They get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and they literally meditate for 3 hours. That is just, I think that they're built that way. That's what they're meant to do, and God bless them, because I think there's a purpose for that. I think they help hold the energy. When you think about Buddhist monks who meditate for 5 hours a day, I think there are people who, before they come into this experience, this life, I think we all have kind of a blueprint and a plan, and I think some people are meant to kind of hold that frequency. And then there are people like me who barely get through an hour. So if you have that kind of busy mind, you might find that one type of meditation calms it more than another. So if you've tried one thing and it didn't work, be open-minded to try something else. So mindfulness meditation is usually when there's like a body scan or you're following the breath. It's always a guided meditation. That's what I'm certified in, because when I do a group, it's easier for me to lead a meditation while I'm walking people through it. I also have some other modalities where I think my voice helps create some changes, and it shifts your frequency, and it allows some blockages to be unblocked and stuff. So mindfulness started with the Buddhists, but there are other Buddhist practices and techniques of meditation. It just happens to be that mindfulness is one of the ones that's pretty easily talked about these days. Mantra meditation really came out of the Hindu practice of like transcendental meditation. That's my personal practice. That's the one that I do when I'm at home. And I do between 20 minutes and an hour at each setting, and I do 2 sittings. Moving meditation, a lot of times people don't realize this, but yoga is a form of meditation. It's just a moving meditation. You're moving energy through the body, you're stretching the muscles. Also Tai Chi and Qigong. I do a little Tai Chi movement a lot of times in my classes. If you were in my morning class, the plate thing that we did with the moving meditation, that kind of came out of Tai Chi. That's not actually a Tai Chi, it's something I made up, but it kind of works very similar to some Tai Chi movements. I like to include prayer in here. I like to also explain what prayer is. I remember when I was younger, my grandmother asked me, you know, we weren't very religious, but when I went to my grandmother, she wanted me to pray before going to bed, and she said, prayer is not about asking for a pony. It's about being in appreciation and thanking God for things. So, and I was like, okay. She's like, you ask stuff all day long. But now, many years later, I think about how many people talk about appreciation. So prayer would be a form of meditation if you're sitting in contemplation, if you're sitting in silence, if you're sitting in appreciation. Prayer is not about asking for things. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's a different type of that's more of a, it's a different energetic process that's going on. But if you're in prayer and contemplation or sitting in silence, so I like to kind of include all of the religions in here so it doesn't seem like I'm just going to the Hindu and the Eastern traditions. Sound meditations, all you got to do is get on YouTube and you'll have all kinds of sound meditations. So chakra balancing meditations have, you know, certain frequencies and they resonate with the body. There's a guy named Jonathan Goldman that does wonderful meditations for chakras, and you make the sounds. And when you make the sounds, you feel those parts of the body vibrating. So when you look at all of these main chakras and you make certain sounds, they vibrate that area of the body. And when they vibrate the area of the body, they stimulate the gland that is associated to it. So if you're doing a humming, sometimes like with kids, you can do like a bumblebee meditation where they, and you know after a while you get a little buzzy up in the sinuses and stuff, and it feels kind of cool, and the kids giggle and they like it. Well, it's also stimulating the pituitary and the pineal glands, which, you know, create chemistry and help you sleep and you know, all kinds of other things going on in the body. So just be aware that when you do some of these sound meditations, you can go to a yoga studio where people, you know, use the singing bowls or the crystal bowls, and you can be immersed in one of those sound baths, and you just buzz and vibrate all throughout the body. And that a lot of times will bring energy to the surface and help you clear energy blocks. And you may not even know that's going on, but you know, a day or two later, things start moving. If you've been a little stagnant in your energy, you've been trying to do something and things aren't moving, a lot of times something like that will move it. And unless you really understand how energy works, you don't connect the dots sometimes between that yoga sound immersion and energy in your life starting to move. I like to also say that a lot of sound meditations, there's one called binaural beats. I would research that before you do it, because some people, for many people, it has brought them to a higher level of consciousness, but a lot of people also end up getting tinnitus. And binaural beats it's literally like you use it with earphones, and it puts one signal in one ear and another signal in another ear, and then your brain brings one signal up and one signal down, so they meet somewhere in the middle. And for people who have tinnitus, in some people it can cure their tinnitus, and other people it makes the tinnitus much worse. So if you have ringing in your ears or tinnitus or tinnitus, however you like to pronounce that, I would think twice about doing the binaural beats. Theta meditations, DNA, singing bowls, tuning forks, all of those kind of things are things that have been created to kind of help with vibration. And some of those are visualizations. Sometimes you're imagining colors as you're going through your chakra system. Guided visualizations, I like to point out visualization is different from meditation, and I'll explain that in one of the next slides. But, you know, using your mind to envision something is very different than finding neutrality. And for real purists who they believe meditation is really about clearing the mind and having no thought. And really you don't have total no thought. Your brain is always going to kick back in and have some thoughts. But visualization a lot of times is a way of kind of focusing the brain and still allowing you to be in a positive mood. So some little tips for meditation. If you're seated, you can be lotus, that's the cross-legged, and that's hard for some people to do. I meditate just from a chair, but for many years I meditated cross-legged lotus. As I get older, I find it a little harder. I always like to say straighten the back, because if you have any kind of energetic pranic effect, it's going to run through the body a little bit easier if your spine is straight. So I used to know somebody who would meditate in one of those bean bags, and she'd flop all down, but it was comfortable for her. So work with it, whatever works best for you. But for me personally, I like to have a straight spine. Your shoulders should be even, and a lot of times just kind of check in with yourself as you're sitting down to see how you're holding yourself. I like to have the knees a little bit below the hips, because it opens the front of the body up so that you're breathing a little bit easier. If you're sitting lotus style, you sit on a little cushion and let your knees hang down a little bit so that you kind of, again, lift the body up. And if you're leaning forward or leaning back, you're going to put more emphasis on those muscles, and you're not going to be able to hold that posture for very long. So if you're sitting up straight, your core, your center core of gravity is going to hold you up for a longer time. So don't curl forward. You can lie down, and then a lot of times I have people lie down. If I do something in a yoga studio, they're always laying down. But I also notice that a lot of people fall asleep when they're laying down. So there are times where you might need to fall asleep, and that's good. But if you're meditating for the energetic and the prana effects, you're not going to have the same results if you fall asleep. Sleep is good, though, and a lot of times you're going to need sleep. So if the body wants you to fall asleep during meditation, that's fine too. But I'll point out that there are some differences. In the beginning, with the prep, I like to just breathe through the back of the throat. That's a cleansing breath, kind of releases any CO2 if it's been building up in the body. I like to also do alternate nostril breathing. If you're not familiar with that, it's very easy to find on YouTube. If you picked up one of my books, I have a worksheet on there on alternate nostril breathing. And it has a Hindu pranayama name, but I go by alternate nostril breathing. It's easier. And then that helps to calm the mind. If you start with some of that alternate nostril breathing, literally, you breathe in through one side of the nose and then out through the other. You have different circuitry from each side of the nasal passages, and it stimulates different parts of the brain. And there's something in that kind of pushing down one side of the nose and breathing in, and then releasing and switching over and alternating that airflow through. It changes and it calms down the brain. So if you have that kind of monkey mind when you've tried to meditate, try doing a couple of minutes of alternate nostril breathing before meditation, and see if you notice your brain being a little bit calmer. I find it helps me a lot. Your eyes can be closed or open. For the most part, I do close if I'm in a safe environment, but a lot of times I like to sit in a park, and I'm not going to close my eyes in a park. So if your eyes are open, you would just focus on something. Sometimes people meditate and focus on a flame of a candle, or if you're sitting out in a park, you could focus on water or a leaf or clouds or whatever. So it's really up to you for the environment that you're in. And then you would just choose your focus, whether you're going to do a mantra or follow your breath or look at a candle. You can have your palms up or down. Palms up, the reason they do that is because there is an energy field around you, not only created by you, but also coming out of the air. I think it probably comes in with our oxygen. So when your palms are up, sometimes you'll start to feel some activity in the palms, and that means that it's pulling some of that energy in, and it's energizing you. But say you're in an environment where you just kind of want to chill out a little bit, you want to, maybe do some breathing, focus on the breathing. But, maybe you're in an environment like the airport, and you don't want to pull all that energy in. You can keep your hands down and kind of circulate your own energy so you're not picking up people's fears and kind of negative energy. So usually palms are up, and you can use mudras. Mudras are the finger positions that are used in meditation, and the finger meditation or the finger mudras, there is an aspect of when you push certain fingers together, it does activate certain like alignments in your body. So if you push some of your fingers together, you can feel that it tightens areas under your arm and starts to open some of your lungs, but also it creates an energetic flow. That's not my specialty, so I won't talk too much more about mudras, but a lot of times people do like to put their fingers in certain formations and allows that energy to flow better. Breath, I don't want to skip intention. I do believe that there is a mind-body connection, so if you're going to sit down and meditate, you might as well add an intention to it. It doesn't take any extra time. So, why are you sitting down to meditate? Are you going to do you want to heal the body? Do you want to align with something? Just set a little intention. Sometimes ask for a little help from above, whatever feels comfortable to you, but just go ahead and set that intention. It's like lining up the energy. So if that energy does come to you, you kind of know because you're the one that's focusing it and directing it. Breath for meditation, unlike therapeutic breathing, where you're oftentimes breathing in through the nose or out through the mouth, or you're rapidly breathing in and out, you have in meditation, breathing in through the nose and out through the nose, slower and fuller breaths. You're trying to calm the mind, and by slowing the breath down, that helps. The amount of time, like I say, I think at least 20 minutes if you're thinking about creating a dedicated practice, because the studies show that the chemistry in the body usually starts to happen at least 20 minutes in. So it doesn't mean that if you only have 5 minutes that there's not some benefit, but if you are able to have 20 minutes, I think there's more benefit for going anywhere from 20 minutes to a half hour at a minimum. And I also like to say, look for a feeling of detachment. I always meditate for at least 20 minutes to a half hour, but it takes me sometimes 10 minutes to calm my mind. So once you kind of go through that, quieting of the mind, then you kind of slip into another layer where it's even more calm. And every once in a while, the brain will try to come back online and have a thought. And that's okay. Just refocus yourself and just release the thought. But look for a feeling of a detachment after a while. Usually around the 20-minute mark, I really feel detached and I don't want to come out of my meditation. I know my hands are there. Sometimes I'll even purposefully touch them in my lap. I know they're touching, but I'm so detached. I know my hands are there, but I can't really tell. Are they turned out? Are they turned in? Are they touching? I have that feeling and that sense of detachment. And from my opinion is that's what I'm looking for. I don't want to stop my meditation until I get to that point of detachment. For your mindset, when you're in any kind of meditation, you want to be the observer. So if you're noticing pain, don't beat up on yourself. Don't think, oh, I'm a weak person, I've got pain, or I've got illness, or anything like that. You want to be an observer and be very neutral about it. And don't be judgmental about it, because what you're really trying to do is stop that pattern of energy that has been feeding it. And by finding that little sweet spot of neutrality, you disconnect the negative charge from that energy, and then it allows the energy to kind of start flowing in a new direction. So finding that little sweet spot of neutrality where you're not judgmental about yourself, you're not judgmental about anyone else, you're present, you're in the moment, you're very accepting of where things are, you're just allowing things to unfold. That's kind of the mindset that you want to be in. And then the thoughts, like I say, your brain has a purpose, and your brain is always going to try and come back online. It's not used to being quieted, and it doesn't like it. So don't be surprised if you start thinking. You're always going to think. The trick in meditation is to be aware when the brain starts thinking again and release it. In the beginning, you're training your mind. So you'll have a thought, and then it's like a rabbit that you follow down the hole, and the next thing you know, it's been 15 minutes and you've been churning a conversation over in your mind for 20 minutes. That's what you're trying to train yourself out of. You'll still have that thought, but in a meditator, you're going to notice you've had that thought and you're not going to follow it. You're just going to release it. I also say a lot of times keep a little notebook next to you, because I also like to say sometimes you get inspired thought, and there is some finessing and understanding the difference between mindful chatter and that kind of ego coming on and inspired thought, because when you get into that state of detachment and you're able to start releasing resistance and letting the mind just calm down, a lot of times you come up with solutions to things that you've been looking for a long time, and that's why I call inspired thought. And a lot of times people confuse those two, and they get an inspired thought and then they chase it away. No, thought's not right now. There are times where I come out of a meditation and I write down a note because all of a sudden I've had an aha moment. So sometimes it's nice to have a little notebook next to you or something like that if you, and it also helps in the beginning, because sometimes that to-do list, oh, I've got to call Sarah. Oh my God, what if I forget to call her when I come out of meditation? Write it down, you know it's going to be there, and then it frees up your mind to sit for 20 minutes. For those of you who are familiar with the energetics, this is where I like to kind of walk over, and I get a little out of the science side of things and into the metaphysical aspects. So anyone who is familiar with universal laws, the law of one, the law of attraction, there are a lot of laws out there. It's just like gravity. You don't have to know about them to, the apple's going to fall whether you know about gravity or not. So when you are talking about meditation, visualization, and sleep, it has a different energetic effect on you. So in meditation, you're always looking for neutral emotions. And I like to point out that neutrality is not apathy. You can still have compassion for people even when you step back and become an observer, but you're really looking for some neutrality, and usually that neutrality is around yourself when you're meditating. You're in a state of no thought. Your frequency will raise if you understand about frequency and vibration. If you don't, you might want to pick up one of my workbook. It talks about frequency, and it explains to you, you are vibrational beings. You have a vibration at your atomic level, and when you start to meditate, that frequency can shift and you can feel it. And that's, if you've ever felt a little buzzy in meditation, that's what's happening. Your frequency is starting to shift. So your frequency will raise in meditation, and if you follow law of attraction, you're in that state of allowing. There weren't a lot of people who raised their hand in this one, so you may not understand that, and that's okay. But in visualization is a little different. Instead of being neutral, you're directing it into positive. If you are into law of attraction and into manifesting, this is a really important step. So I'm not saying this is not as good as this. This is just as important, but you're focused on positive emotion, you're having thought, you can still raise your frequency, and at this point, you're in a state of attracting. You're actually focusing that energy and telling it where to go. Whereas if you fall asleep, you could be dreaming, you could be non-dreaming. You could have thought, you could have no thought. Your emotions vary. You can have a nightmare, or you could have, like a wonderful dream. So you're all over the place, processing emotions, processing thoughts. But at a certain point, you stop thought. You go into that deeper realm of sleep, and your frequency will raise, but you're not attracting. So for people who are into manifesting, that is why you don't want to fall asleep when you're in meditation, because you take yourself out of the allowing and the attracting, and everything goes into stasis mode. So again, that may not make sense to you if you don't really understand about law of attraction, but sometimes I get a lot of people that knows about that, so I put that in there. Developing a personal practice. Now, I also like to, and I'm coming up on the hour, so if anyone needs to scoot out, you're not going to hurt my feelings, but if you have another 5 minutes. I like to say there is a difference. A lot of times people will meditate, and in my early days of meditating, it was a reactive response. I'd be stressed out. I'd have a test. I learned to meditate when I was in college, and I would only meditate when I was stressed out. And then everything would go great for a month or two and I'd never meditate. That all changed when I started being really stressed out, and this was, about 10, 11 years ago. I started with therapeutic breathing, then I started a really dedicated practice of transcendental meditation. And when I did that, after about 6 to 10 months, I started having energy move through the body. I started buzzing and vibrating during the night anytime I laid down. All kinds of weird stuff was starting to happen. I was starting to see energy. I can see auras around people now. I can feel and touch energy. I can touch a tree and I can feel its energy. I can run my hands over my body or someone else's body and kind of sense energy signatures and stuff. So that isn't going to come if you're just doing a light practice of here and there, hit or miss. But if you do a dedicated practice, you might eventually notice that. It might take a year because your frequency very slowly raises. But I actually believe that we are in a frequency shift on the planet. So even if you're not doing any of the work, your frequency is going to shift. And there are some complications about shifting your frequency if you're not aware of it. Things that you've attracted in a lower frequency may not be a match when you're at a higher frequency. So sometimes things fall out of your life, relationships, friendships, jobs, opportunities, and sometimes it can seem like a crisis in your life, but in actuality, you're clearing space for things to come in that are a better match for your newfound frequency. So when you're developing a practice, be intentional. I always say just be intentional and ask. Determine the type of meditation practice you want. Do you like mindfulness? Do you like TM? Try a bunch of different ones, see which works. For people who are really active and like sports, they might like Tai Chi or something like that because it's moving and you can keep your eyes open. If you're kind of a chill type of personality, you might be really good with TM or mindfulness. Determine how many times and how long you're going to do it, the frequency and duration. Again, I think you're going to get the chemistry benefits if you do it at least for 20 minutes a day. Even better yet, twice a day for 20 minutes, and if you can push it to a half hour, that would be good too. I don't meditate every single day, and I don't hit that afternoon every single day. So, you do what you can do in the reality that you live. Learn the difference between monkey mind and inspirational thought. We went over that. Consider a notepad. We went over that. If you're working with children, there are groups that come in and will train teachers that specialize with young kids, but just be aware that the attention spans can be much shorter with the little ones. And you got to kind of make it fun. So a lot of times you'll do like a buzzing bumblebee meditation. You can do an internet search on that. And that's fun for kids. You might want to start and have them journal before and after. So in the beginning, you might ask them, how do you feel right now? If you're working with kids, you never know what their home life is like. They might be having a lot of trauma at home, or they might have a very happy life at home. But if they're journaling, you might start noticing some patterns in them if they're working with some difficult things at home. And then make a game of it. Try for a minute to have them focus on something. I have a focusing technique in my workbook, but basically you can, sometimes people give raisins, and you put a raisin in the mouth and you don't chew it, you don't swallow it, you kind of do a mindfulness, Does it taste sweet? How does it taste? Is it soft? And, after a minute, does it taste sweeter? And so you can kind of, again, you don't do that with really young kids who are going to choke on it, but it can be a nice focusing technique. You could maybe do a singing bowl and ask them to close their eyes, and what do they hear? Do you hear one note? Do you hear two notes? Sometimes with the singing bowls, you can hear a high note and a low note, and a lot of times until you point it out, you don't realize that, but you can kind of hear that kind of blending. So that's the singing bowl. You can lead them in a body scan. You can have them do some belly breathing and see how that feels. And then when you're finished, have them journal again and see if they feel a little calmer. For little ones, they may not be able to do more than 3 minutes or 5 minutes. For older kids, they might be able to go a little bit longer. For little kids, it might just be a couple of seconds. But if you can connect them to the breath, it helps calm them. We've gone over most of this, but the effects of meditation go beyond the body. So not only do you get physical chemistry changes, the pranic effects, you can have chakra openings and other things. I've had full-blown chakra openings, and they are not subtle. It's not like a little gentle, buzzing through the body. It like lifts you and contorts you, and it's scary if you don't know what's going on. So if you do a really dedicated practice where you're having longer periods of meditation, I like to talk about this because a lot of times people don't talk about it, and it can be scary if you don't know that it's related to the meditation. When it started for me, I wasn't in meditation. I was waking up at 3 a.m. buzzing. In the beginning, I thought there was a piece of equipment underneath my condo that was going off at 3 a.m. because it was happening really regularly at 3 a.m. Then it started happening in meditation, and I started realizing it was my pineal gland. It was things that were shaking inside of me. But, for weeks and weeks, I was getting dressed and going down and checking equipment because I have storage units underneath me. I was thinking my blood sugars were off. Eventually, a couple of years later, I had full-blown chakra openings, which are sometimes called kundalini awakenings. And they can be, they're not subtle. They can be very, very forceful. It's like water that's dammed up, and it keeps banging against a door, and eventually when that door opens, the water rushes out. That's how the energy is. When it comes through, when it came through my heart chakra, I was lying down. It always seems to be when I'm lying down. And it lifted me out of bed. Like physically, it felt like a hand was pushing up into my heart, and it channeled up and out through the throat. And I know about all of this stuff, and it was scary. So I like to talk about it, even though it seems weird. It's probably not going to happen to most of you, but if it does, I just want you to know that it can happen. And they're called Kundalini awakenings, and it's usually just for people who are doing really extensive work because they're rapidly changing the frequency in all of their chakras. And when that energy releases, it comes through blockages that most people have blocked down for life. So I do like to talk about the pranic effects because it is the weird and woo-woo side of meditation that a lot of times people don't talk about because they're worried about what people are going to think about them. So changes in thinking, a lot of that is due to the chemistry, but as your frequency starts to shift, you also become more compassionate, more heart-centered, and depending upon what your frequency is, your perception of reality changes. So oftentimes when people start doing meditation, they start having a different perspective on life. Things change in their life. The music that they used to listen to doesn't appeal to them anymore. The food that they used to eat doesn't agree with them or doesn't appeal to them. People that they used to follow or that they used to like, or friends that they used to like to hang out with, a lot of times that can change. And if you don't understand about frequency and that you don't understand that it's clearing space to allow these new things to come in that are a better match, it can be surprising. So changes in thinking, calmer, less reactive, more compassionate, heart-centered, increased creativity, life changes, and increased synchronicity. I had a whole session yesterday on synchronicity. If you get into meditation, you might start noticing weird coincidences, and there are no coincidences. Those are just synchronicities because you're starting to get in tune with the energy, and your higher self, that part of you that is in tune with that energy, is having you look at the clock right at 11:11, or you're starting to see cardinal birds. That's why I had my book was called The Cardinal Mysteries. So you might start seeing increased synchronicity. And we don't have time to do the meditations, but you can dive down a little bit more into information, and you can stay and ask any questions. But I've kept you 10 minutes past. I'm sorry. It's always hard for me to squeeze everything in 15 minutes. So I thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much.